Hey class, I'm back. So I hope you're ready, that you've had a chance to review the course overview video, and now this is your long lost video lecture on communication theory. And this is for both my Speech 1315 and 1321 classes, the fundamentals of effective speech and the business and professional communication, because both courses start with the communication theory part. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And you have to bear with me because I am normally a face-to-face teacher, as I may have mentioned. So I don't know how to do all the bells and whistles that you can do with all this fun video stuff. So a lot of the visual aids I actually uploaded for you under handouts. And so I'll tell you how to get to those as they're pertinent to the place in the lecture. So there's a couple things I want to show you before we get started. This is the book for 1315, A Pocket Guide to Public Speaking. This is the 6th edition, if you can get a hold of it. An earlier edition is fine too. You'll just be missing the chapter, I think, on citing sources, but it'll be embedded in the book. So if you can get a hold of this, use electronic, cheap, however you can, that's fine too. The 5th edition is fine. And then for my 1321 classes, this is the Communicating for Results book, Cheryl Hamilton, and this is the 11th edition. Remember, the bookstore, the EPCC bookstore, is selling you a special edition copy of this where there's no binding. It's just loose pages that are not saran wrapped, but you know what I mean. Have the plastic wrap on them, and then you're supposed to drop it into your own notebook. Do whatever you can. Get it. My books are so expensive, class. You can get this used. There's even an electronic version. Get whatever is cheapest for you. Is my advice. But you do have the one. Should have the one available to you at the bookstore. Okay, and the other thing that you need, and if you didn't download it, that's okay, it's under handouts, and this is the Communication Theory Lecture Study Guide. So that's what I'm using for this lecture in lieu of a PowerPoint. Some of your other lessons will be voiceover PowerPoints, but not this one. So if you have the handout, if you have a printer at home and you can print this out and follow along, that will be groovy. Otherwise, you can access this later and it has the outline of the information. So let me go ahead and start. And the reason why these courses do communication theory is this is the broad theory in terms of what is this thing called communication, and how does it work? What are the different factors that influence communication? Because whether you're getting up in front of an audience in a public speaking situation for the Speech 1315 class, and you're viewing communication in that sense, or we're talking about interpersonal communication between people or small group, and the same thing for 1321, whether we're talking about an interview or the small group communication at work, or like I said, between people, so you're communicating with colleagues. This is the broad umbrella, all right, the theory that applies to all of that. And some of the factors, some of the things that you need to consider when you're sending and receiving messages. And that's the first thing, class. The message is the primary term for the field of communication. As I mentioned last time, I believe in the course overview for both courses, the message is what we're concerned with. What message am I sending versus what message is being received? Okay, are you still awake? I hope so. So if you have your handout, and even if you don't, on the second page of it, there's some guiding questions. So these are the questions I want you to think about, and these are the questions that you should be able to answer after you read the chapter and after, hopefully, after you listen to this lecture and you have a chance to kind of think about these concepts and apply them to your own communication. So the first one is, what is communication? I mean, yes, obviously, most of us have some sort of operational definition for communication, but we're going to really break this down as we go through this material, because what really is it? I mean, both books talk about when we've achieved shared meaning, okay, then we have communicated, shared meaning. So then we have communication. You can look up the technical definitions in your book, but we're really going to go into some of the details here. And specifically, both books, we're going to answer the question, what is the transactional model? What is the transactional model of communication? Because that is the model that the communication field now really accepts. And both books have their own version of this. And you can even, in Google or whatever, you can type in the transactional model of communication and it'll pull up some diagrams of it for you. And there'll be different renderings, but the basics are the same. So for the Speech 1315 class, yours is on page 8 and it's figure 1.1, the communication process. And as long as we're at it, from this book's perspective, it defines shared meaning as the mutual understanding of a message between the speaker and audience. And so here's your diagram. You want to study this. And for my 1321 class, your model is actually on pages 8 and 9. The transactional model is down here. It's actually on page 9. Okay, this one. So when we're talking about all these terms, that's what you want to look at. You want to look at these models. Okay, communication, and some of the key terms for this model is communication is viewed as a simultaneous transactional process between senders and receivers. And we're gonna look at this. And that, okay. So those are the things to follow along. So our big questions: what is communication? What is this transactional model of communication? Because that's really what we're using to answer the first question. And what is rhetoric? And this goes back to the origins of public speaking and of communication, right? And those of you who may have studied history or hopefully paid attention in your history classes, rhetoric goes back to the ancient Greeks, to ancient Greece, and particularly Aristotle is the one who defined, philosopher, if you remember him, philosopher and teacher. It's hard to get through your college career without running into Aristotle. And so really rhetoric is another word for public speaking, the art of public speaking. Sometimes rhetoric is used to imply that, oh, it was just a bunch of rhetoric, to imply that it was a bunch of words that were not necessarily true. And that's not how we mean it in communication theory. Really, rhetoric, if you want to get right down to it, rhetoric is the construction of messages to achieve a particular purpose. The construction of messages to achieve a particular purpose. So that's what but usually rhetoric is public speaking is what we, but really you're crafting your language, you're crafting your speech, you're crafting your communication to achieve a particular purpose. Then the next thing we want to answer is, why do so many miscommunications occur? Because the problem is, we talk about, there was a breakdown in communication. They got a divorce because they couldn't communicate, or, this all happened, chaos ensued because it was a communication breakdown. Well, okay, but the problem there then is not communication, it's miscommunication. And if you look at the word, quite literally, it's a communication that's missed, right? The message was not received in the manner that the sender intended. And why then, logically, we want to know, well, if miscommunication is the problem, then how do we minimize the potential for miscommunication? And then something that I did emphasize in the course overview lecture, we sometimes forget that when we miscommunicate, there is a cost. And this is really what concerns businesses. So if we're going to link this back to 1321, business communication. Every year, millions of dollars, companies, businesses lose, we're talking the big ones, they lose millions of dollars a year because of miscommunications. Okay, that's the cost, millions of dollars. So a lot of time, miscommunication costs us money. Sometimes it costs us time, as I mentioned before. Sometimes it costs us a relationship. We get into a big brouhaha, there's a miscommunication, it escalates, and people get their noses out of joint. And if we're not able to reconcile those differences or be able to explain the reasons for that miscommunication, that's it. Sometimes people, that's the end. They don't care. They don't accept the what happened with the miscommunication, and that's the end of the relationship. And then very seriously, miscommunication can cost lives. Um, so I asked this question right now because this course, I hope, class, you will apply it to your own lives. I hope this is going to help you apply it to your own lives and to future course presentations. So right now, I want you to think of a time in your own life when a miscommunication cost you something. And sometimes they're humorous, right? And they're stupid, they're silly. The one mine's not that serious, but I remember it was terrible because my poor colleague, it caused us anxiety and stress. It was also embarrassing. So my colleague was supposed to meet us for this very important meeting. We were making a presentation to some of the administrators. It was kind of a big deal. I won't go into all the details. So I had texted him and I said, yes, meet us in room, whatever the room number was, 36E. But I forgot to, and so here's what happened. So we're over at the Rio Grande campus and we're waiting for him. We're like, well, where's Keith? Where's Keith? Because he's normally very. So I get this text from Keith. I'm walking all over Valle Verde. Where's room 36E or whatever the room number was? I had forgotten in the text to say it's Rio Grande. And he assumes, since we taught at Valle Verde, obviously, that it was VV. And I just omitted that information. It was my fault. I should have told him RG, Rio Grande campus. Fortunately, there was enough time for him to get from VV to Rio Grande before the presentation started. But see, duh. And part of the problem was it was a text message, and a lot of times key information gets omitted when it's a written communication. So that's one off the top of my head that happened to me. You can think of your own. And that one was silly, but it was embarrassing, and it could have been really bad if we had not arrived there like an hour ahead of time. He might have been very late to the presentation, and it was my fault. So that's an example. Communication has a cost. And when I talk, and I'm going to give you the examples I'm about to give you come from the 1321 book, Communicating for Results by Cheryl Hamilton. It is our textbook for 1321, but they also apply to 1315. So, and these are older examples, and they come from an older version of her book, and I just think they're better examples, but they're old. Okay, they're not from the 2000s, but they're funny. They demonstrate the point. So, and it demonstrates the cost. So the first one I'm going to tell you, actually, I'm going to ask you a question. How many of you like Dr. Pepper? Like the soda, you drink Dr. Pepper. And so I don't know how many of you do. I'm trying to switch more to tea and flavored water myself. But anyway, so here's the point. Back in the 1970s, there was a very popular Dr. Pepper commercial. And it's kind of fun because we don't see this so much anymore in modern commercials. But back then, if you were a struggling musician and you wanted to, you were kind of like, just like actors and actresses are struggling and you spend a lot of your life being waiters and waitresses, waiting for your big break, trying to get the audition or whatever. Well, back in the day, same thing for musicians. You're trying to make it big. Well, back then, musicians could make a living by writing original scores that were called jingles. And so you could kind of pay the rent by writing these original scores called jingles for different commercials, if you were lucky, right? If you were lucky too, because there's no free lunch. But these days, I don't see that. They're not original scores. It seems like these companies just use old rock songs to go along with their commercials. But in any case, in the 1970s, there was a real popular one called, and it was for Dr. Pepper. And I feel the need to kind of demonstrate it for you. And here's the way the song went. It went, I'm a pepper, you're a pepper, wouldn't you want to be a pepper too, Dr. Pepper? Drink Dr. Pepper. Okay, jazz hands, right? You got to have the jazz hands. And as a matter of fact, class, if you want to look at that commercial, under handouts, the handouts tab in Blackboard, if you click on that, I actually have the video. Don't worry that the screen looks black, that there's no thumbnail. I don't know why it's not. Just click watch video and it should come up. You'll see the original 1970s commercial. And it was very popular. I was on the playground, because yes, I was little back then. So we would be on the playground, and it was a very catchy tune. And not only was it a catchy tune, it worked. I believe it's Coca-Cola that makes Dr. Pepper. They made millions of dollars. It was the campaign, the commercial was very, very successful. It helped sell more Dr. Peppers, and they made a lot of money. So Coca-Cola, though, turns around and they use the same commercial in Great Britain, in England. And, they already knew what Dr. Pepper was already over there. They were already drinking the sodas. It was the commercial that did not work. And they couldn't figure it out. They're like, why was this commercial so successful in the US, but here in England, we're not seeing the same results in terms of money making? Well, the advertising people, after they looked at what was going on, here was what they came up with. It turned out that in England at the time, pepper was British slang for prostitute. So when the Brits are listening to the commercial, here's what they're hearing. I'm a hoe, you're a hoe, wouldn't you like to be a hoe too? Jazz hands again. Anyway, so that's what they're hearing. And it wasn't the soda, it was the commercial. Because and go watch it. Click on handouts, click on that video, and imagine being a British person listening to it, right? I'm a prostitute, be a prostitute too. So that's what went wrong. And it sounds silly, but this is documented by the textbook, right? So, but what was the cost? They lost a lot of money in England because it didn't work. Another example, and I didn't give you a picture of the car. Figure you can Google it yourself. Type in Chevy Nova. So I don't know how many of you are car buffs out there, but there was also a vehicle. This is an older example too, called the Chevy Nova. And if you're a car buff, you may know about it. Very popular vehicle. GM made it, and so the Chevy Nova. Hey man, they sell great in the U.S. Sell wonderful in America, because think of the name Nova. Oh my God, what's a nova? It's an exploding star. So we're going to be driving this car. Woo, that's like an exploding star. So how cool is that? Well, GM turns around and they market the vehicle in Mexico, the Chevy Nova. And it doesn't go so well. Again, they lose money on the Chevy Nova. And they're like, what the heck? Why is this not working? Language again, class. In Spanish, in English, it's the Chevy Nova, the exploding star. In Spanish, it's the Chevy No Va, the Chevy No Go. And who the heck wants to drive a car that's not going to go? And so that was the association, the Chevy No Go, No Va. So seriously, that was the analysis. Again, they lost a lot of money. So these are silly examples, but that's what really happened. And for my math people, this is also, and maybe my space people, I really follow the space program. Um, I really like Star Trek, Star Wars, all of that fun stuff. But here we are in real life. So I don't know if you all have followed this at all. And this was several years ago, I think maybe close to a decade. If I say it's a few years ago, it's probably more like 10 or 15 years ago. But we received all those fabulous photos of Mars, right? Actual photographs of Mars, the surface of Mars. And now, of course, the big goal with SpaceX and these kind of private, these government private partnerships, then with NASA, etc., is to get us to Mars. That's one of our new goals, is to try to get us to Mars. Anyway, the photographs of Mars, though, of the surface, we may have had those a lot sooner if this had not happened. And here we go. So the first Mars orbiter that was supposed to go to Mars and take pictures of the surface and orbit around Mars, and we were going to get all these great photographs, right? Well, here's what happened. So Lockheed Martin built the actual spacecraft, the Mars orbiter. And if you know anything about Lockheed Martin, they're originally a British company, right? Well, NASA, though, controls the spacecraft. So you have to, the two businesses have to, the two organizations have to coordinate together, yes? So NASA is in charge of running the spacecraft. Lockheed Martin built it. Here's what happened. When measuring the force of the small control thrusters, which is what keeps the orbiter at a safe orbit around the planet, okay, Lockheed Martin used pounds, a British measure. NASA used newtons for these same computations. And if you learned anything in your high school or elementary science classes, newtons and pounds are not equivalent. They do not equal each other. Okay. So, consequently, the Mars orbiter was too close to the atmosphere, was sucked into the atmosphere and exploded. Boom. Millions of dollars, lots of time and work, literally up in smoke. Okay. And these are rocket scientists making this mistake, class. They did not convert their units. This is another silly miscommunication, but it's what happened. And again, time and money, cost time and money. And I won't spend too much time on this, but you can think of there's a lot of other examples, even in NASA catastrophes, like the Space Shuttle Challenger, which exploded, that was supposed to have the first teacher in space. And of course, she died along with all the other astronauts. And then also, I don't know if you're familiar with the Space Shuttle Columbia. They died, that astronaut crew died also. A lot of the things that went wrong that were mechanical things. In the first case, it was the O-ring. In the second case, it was something with the tiles that protected the shuttle from the heat re-entering the atmosphere. Anyway, they knew about them. But because there were lots of miscommunications, lives were lost. I mean, that was the cost. It was lives. And there's been a lot of investigation into this with the Rogers Commission. So I'm emphasizing this to you because the costs of miscommunication can be high. And in fact, bring this up to the present moment. Think of our COVID-19 situation right now, or the COVID-19 situation. There are arguments out there that lives have been lost because of the mixed messaging that we received, because there was no national communication plan mapped out for communicating about COVID-19. And so people are arguing that has cost us lives. And even here in the vaccine rollout, there's confusion because, again, there has been no national plan that was put into place. And you can look at this. It's the federal government versus the states, and the argument is the federal government left it to the states, and so we ended up with this patchwork quilt of communication and no one standard procedure, and that's caused confusion. We've had mixed messaging because it's a new virus, and it's caused lots of confusion. And again, the argument is it has cost lives, particularly the whole mask controversy thing. So you can even bring this up to date and look at our situation. And we'll talk more about this when we get to ethical speaking, but this idea too of ethical speech and facts versus opinion, and not only misinformation but disinformation. So that's the setup. So I want you to think then of the cost, what a time of miscommunication costs you something. So let's analyze what went wrong. Okay, what went wrong and how could these miscommunications be prevented? Again, if you want to view the Dr. Pepper commercial, that's under handouts. The handout, click on the handouts tab and you'll scroll down and you'll see that. There's a couple other things that I'm going to refer to as we move along here. You still awake? I hope so. So we're looking at those questions. Now let's start getting into our concepts here off this sheet and breaking this down. So we have, let's look at our communication definition is basically shared meaning. Our forms of communication, our types of communication, and then the communication is a process, right? So first, let's take a look at the types of communication, which is down here, the second part. So we have interpersonal communication, and that's communication between two or more people. Okay. Inter means between, so between people. But there's also something fun called intrapersonal communication. Intrapersonal communication. And intra, the prefix intra means within. So it's communication within oneself. How do we talk to ourselves? What does that little voice inside our head sound like? So there's different names for this. We call it self-talk, our internal dialogue or monologue, as the case may be. So inter, between people, and intra, how do we talk to ourselves? What does that little voice inside our head sound like? Then we can break this down further. Dyadic communication, dyad is two. So this is two people communicating verbally or non-verbally. And small group communication, which is very important to both Speech 1315 and Speech 1321. A small group is defined as 3 or more people, usually no more than 5 or 6, communicating for a specific purpose. Incidentally, researchers found that the optimal number for a small group is 5 people. Then there's public communication. Public communication is 1 or more people communicating with an audience, where the audience is in the same immediate environment as the communicator and the feedback is immediate. So we're live. We're in front of a live audience. Public communication. Then there's mass communication. 1 or more people are communicating with a massive audience where the audience is not in the same immediate environment. We're watching them on TV. We're listening to them on the radio. And the message is sent via some form of technology and the feedback isn't immediate. What we mean by feedback, if I'm in a classroom and we're in a live classroom, which would normally be the case with me, then the feedback from you all would be immediate. I could see your faces. I could see your nonverbals. You could ask me a question right then. Whereas right now, because this is recorded and we're doing electronically mediated communication, the feedback I receive from you is not immediate. You're going to have to email me your questions, that kind of thing. We can yell at the screen all we want to. We can yell at the radio. Nobody's gonna care. Okay, so those are some types of communication. So now let's talk about, before we go back up to the forms, let's pop down here. Communication is a process involving the following variables. And just to give you a little background on this, and so before the 20th century, starting with the ancient Greeks. Now, that's Western tradition. Keep in mind, that's Western culture. A lot of all cultures have had some tradition of oral communication, right? And public speaking. But this is the US has inherited a lot of our system is based on the ancient Greco-Roman system. So, but I just want you to keep in mind, this is just the Western perspective. Other cultures have their own histories, etc. So, our idea of rhetoric and communication goes back, as we said, to Aristotle and the ancient Greeks. But up until the 20th century, even when colleges and institutions of learning came into being in England and Europe and then here in the US, what you studied was rhetoric. What you studied was public speaking until we hit the 20th century. And what happens in the 20th century? We get mass media, quite frankly. We get of course we had written communication, like the dissemination of propaganda, and then with the printing press, we had books, we had newspapers, that type of thing. But come the 20th century, we get what? We get the radio. Okay, we get the radio. And later on in the 50s, we get TV. And then later on in the 80s and 90s, we get our computer mediated communication and our social media and all of that fun stuff. Why is this important? Because it changed our model of communication a little bit. And it made communication much more significant. So, and our models changed. And this really came into being in World War II. We really became concerned with mass media and mass communication after World War II. Why? We get the radio, the fireside chats with FDR, and we get propaganda. We get Hitler. And so the first conference of communication scholars, rhetoricians, happened after World War II. And these rhetoricians from different universities and institutions of learning came together and they asked themselves, class, this same question. What is communication? What is this thing called communication? And the first model they came up with, and let's see if I can get a little visual for you. The first model they came up with was not the transactional model of communication. And this is not in the Speech 1315 book, but it is in the business book. This was the one-way model, and this is actually called the Shannon-Weaver model of communication. It's sometimes called the pipeline model of communication. And that's because what they did was they came up with the idea of person A and person B, or the source and the receiver, the sender and the receiver, or the source and receiver of the message. So now we're getting into our terms down here. The source of the message, the receiver of the message. And imagine this little piece of paper being the message. So the source of the message is the communicator or the initial sender of the message, right? The receiver is the communicator who receives and interprets the message. So with the first one-way model of communication, because you got to give them a break. It was the first time these rhetoricians were coming up with this. So imagine this is the message, right? Over here, we've got person A, or the source. Person A has to take their ideas, their thoughts, whatever it is they're trying to communicate, and they have to put it into words, language, and also nonverbal, right? Body language and vocal, paralanguage. And we're going to come back to that. That's the 3 codes, but don't worry about that. All of that is the message. They're taking the message, the source, person A, and they send the message across, and you can imagine person B over here, to person B, or the receiver. Now the person B receives the message, the word symbols, the language, the paralanguage, the vocal tone, and the body language, and they have to decode the message. Person A encodes the message, okay, puts their thoughts, feelings into the language code and the nonverbal code and the paralanguage code, sends it across. The receiver receives all that and has to decode or interpret the message. What did person A mean? Okay, and then once good old person B or the receiver figures it out, decodes the message, they then give feedback, give their response to the original sender. They have to encode their response, their thoughts, feelings, etc., and send it back. Okay, so in this first model, though, it's depicted as linear and it's one way. So here's person A. Think of this hand as person A. Person A sends the message to person B. Person B sends it back to person A, and it goes down this little line. Boom. So person A, or source receiver, source receiver, source receiver. It goes this way. All right. Well, like I said, you have to give them a break. It was their first try. Now, after and it was actually called the Macy's Conference, where these rhetoricians came together, and that was their first model. And why were they concerned? They were concerned because of what happened in World War II with Hitler. Okay, and Hitler's ability to manipulate information and propaganda, etc., and he was a very charismatic speaker. He was a very charismatic public speaker, and he would also manipulate aspects of film. He was not a tall or big man in stature, so they would record him on these screens, and they would have those images running behind him, and that would make him appear much larger while he was giving his talk. Now, it wasn't synchronous like it is now. Like, you know how we go to our rock concerts and you're in the nosebleed section, so you have to look at the big screen to be able to see the musician you love? So it wasn't simultaneous like that. It was because they didn't have that ability yet, but they did use these aspects of film. So that's one of the reasons this started happening, was after World War II. How do you and this is something we really need to think about now. How did Hitler take Germany, which was ground into the dust at the end of World War I? Their economy was in the toilet, okay? And here comes Hitler. And he doesn't start at the top, he starts at the bottom. And he works his way up, becomes Fuhrer, and is able to get a whole nation behind him, right? He pulls them out. Their economy starts doing extremely well under Hitler. He had that ability. He was very charismatic. So how do you take a country that was absolutely ground into the dust at the end of World War I, and it damn near takes over the world in World War II, and in the process, is able to scapegoat, torture, and kill systematically 6 million Jewish people? Okay, there's your cost, right there. So this is what was concerning to rhetoricians at the time. Now, after that, what happens in universities is you no longer just study rhetoric with the introduction of radio and then TV in the 50s. Now we get what we traditionally recognize as our mass communication departments, right? Because now we're looking at the mass dissemination of information. And so that's the difference. So now, usually under communication departments, you have the rhetoric division, the public speaking or study of rhetoric, but then you also have the mass production of messages. And a lot of times you have journalism, sometimes is under that umbrella also. So that's the first one. Then later on, there's actually another model that comes into play, and that is the interactional model. Again, Speech 1315, you don't have this, but this is still going to help you understand it. The next model was the circular model, or it's also called the interactional model. And this is a little bit better because look at before, person A, person B, person A, person B, person A, person B, it was like this straight line. In the interactional model, now I have person A, or the source of the message, sends the message across to person B, this hand, who's now the receiver. The receiver decodes the message and then sends their response, which is the feedback, encodes their message back to person A, and now person A is actually person B. Person A is now receiving the message, and now person A is the interpreter, decodes the message, passes his or her response, which is feedback, back to them, and now the message goes back and forth, right? Source, receiver, receiver, source. Source, receiver, now I take a turn, now I'm the source and I send it back, and now this person's receiver, and we go back and forth between. Interactional model, right? Okay, let me ask you something, because aren't you guys getting ready for the Super Bowl? Anybody getting ready for the Super Bowl this Sunday? I have no idea what is it, the GOAT versus the kid, they're saying? Tom Brady, greatest of all time, versus the kid, the young quarterback guy. Anyway, and for those of you who don't like football, we're just there for the food and the libations, yes? Well, let me ask you a question. Those of you who, well, of course, COVID, I hope nobody's having a big Super Bowl party, or if you are, it's outside, you're social distancing, taking proper precautions, etc. But in the past, think of maybe you've gone to a big Super Bowl party, or just your family, right? Your family has a big party, or maybe you come from a big family anyway. You're living in a situation with a lot of family members. So I want to ask you this question. Those of you from a big family, or those of you who've gone to a big party, yeah, not pre-COVID, is communication this nice, neat, back and forth process where, this person A talks to person B, and how nice, and they respond, and da-da-da-da-da, and it's all nice and neat? That might happen in dyadic communication where it's just two people, but when we're in a group, are you kidding me? The messages are flying all over the place, right? There's not just one little message. There's like a million messages, right? These messages are flying everywhere. You're there in the kitchen. There's 2-3 people in the kitchen at the Super Bowl party, right? There's a couple coolers. So there's lots of people outdoors. So you're milling around. One person comes in, they open up the cooler, and they're like, hey man, who drank the last Budweiser? Right? So there's that message. Someone else there is saying, hey, shut up, I'm trying to watch the game. And then someone else who's in the kitchen may say, hey man, did you see our cousin's girlfriend? Do you think he got her pregnant? And then someone else is, be quiet, I'm listening for the doorbell. And then finally, after a whole bunch of other nonsense, somebody finally says, I drank the last Budweiser, right? So it's not this nice, neat, and back and forth process. The messages are flying all over the place. This class is the idea or the theory behind the transactional model. That's the one we accept now. This one. Figure 1.3 for 1321, and Figure 1.1 for Speech 1315. And the key words for the transactional model. Trans means across, remember? Inter means between. So we're no longer in the inters. We believe communication is a trans process. It's a cross. It's not this nice back and forth neat little process. In fact, here are the key terms. Communication is viewed as a simultaneous transactional process between senders and receivers. In other words, we're not neatly taking turns. We are simultaneously, person A and person B are simultaneously the source and receiver of messages. We are simultaneously sending and receiving messages. And it's circular because we go around in a little feedback loop. I'm sending the message, you're decoding it. Then you encode your feedback, I'm decoding that. Now I'm encoding my response, which is feedback. And we get in a little feedback loop. Yes? So, how can I simultaneously, you're still awake, aren't you? Okay. How can I simultaneously be sending and receiving a message if I'm in the same time and space? If we were in a live classroom right now, okay, we all are. If we were live, if we're in the same immediate time and space, we are simultaneously sending and receiving messages. How? How can I be talking and receiving a message at the same time? Well, presuming that you would not be a rude student and would not be talking at the same time that I am, I'm sending you my verbal message, but what am I receiving? I'm looking at your nonverbals. I'm receiving your nonverbal responses, okay? Because communication is not just about the language code. It's also about the vocal code, the tone of voice, the paralanguage, and our body language, our nonverbals, which a lot of that is we're kind of unconscious of it. When you become a speaker, you become a little more conscious of your nonverbals, etc. But so that's the key. And so if we come down here and we look at our forms of communication, that's also known as communication codes. That's where we're at. Verbal, vocal, and nonverbal. And if come down here to our terms, the source, that person A who's the source of the message, is the communicator or the initial sender of a message. You have to be stimulated and motivated to communicate. You have to take your thoughts, feelings, etc., and encode them into words and body language and paralanguage, and you send it across, as we mentioned before. The receiver, remember, is the person or communicator who receives and interprets the message. Now, don't get encoding and decoding confused with the communication codes, okay? Encoding and decoding is the process of sending and interpreting messages. So encoding, the process that involves taking ideas, thoughts, images, and putting these into verbal and nonverbal symbols. So language, you all, the words are symbols. Language is symbolic. We have words that symbolize what we're talking about. It's an agreed upon system of symbols that we decide. The word paper, that group of sounds is going to stand for this, something like this, right? Or chair is going to stand for that object. In the English language. In Spanish, right? If we're talking about a table, it's mesa, right? Or mesa if you speak Gringanese like me. But seriously, so and it's sort of arbitrary. Our ancestors, who invented the English language or something like it. You look at the Old English and you're going, what? they decided that certain groups of sounds and symbols would stand for certain things, certain objects. The ancestors who invented Spanish did the same thing, but it's kind of arbitrary. If we had decided that this would be called a gobbledygook instead of paper, then it would be called a gobbledygook. So I'm making my point to you that here's the first opportunity for miscommunication. Communication involves codes. Language is a code. It is symbolic. We are technically involved in symbolic interaction when we talk to each other. And then, of course, we have our body language code and our paralanguage code. But in any case, encoding, the process that involves taking ideas, thoughts, images, and putting these into verbal and nonverbal symbols. Decoding, the process of interpreting verbal, nonverbal symbols and translating these back into ideas, thoughts, images to try to figure out what did person A mean? Because again, we're after shared meaning. What is the message? The content of the communication, the content. And I am going to leave you there because I have been blabbing on for 50 minutes. This is part 1. We're going to pick up with part 2 of the communication theory. But for your enjoyment, you can go to handouts, as I mentioned before, watch the Dr. Pepper commercial and imagine what the Brits are hearing. You can also Google the Chevy Nova if you want to. You don't have to. And this is the first part to kind of get you thinking. What is communication? It's this whole idea of the transactional model. It is we're simultaneously receiving messages. It's not a neat back and forth process. Communication is circular because we're getting into a feedback loop. It is circular and it is ongoing. Circular, ongoing, simultaneous. The transactional model. Ongoing. Think of this. Watzlawick, who's one of the fathers of modern communication, try to say his name fast 3 times. Watzlawick, Watzlawick, Watzlawick. Anyway, one of his communication axioms is you cannot not communicate. Think about that. You cannot not communicate. Why? And I'll leave you with that, and that's the same idea in different words, that communication is ongoing. So stay tuned for part 2. Take it easy.